20 years after her death, someone began erasing her name from history. Her face was chiseled from temple walls across an entire empire. Her name was scratched from every obelisk, every inscription, every official list of pharaohs that Egypt had ever kept. And the people responsible for that erasure had the resources of the most powerful kingdom in the ancient world at their disposal, which means they very nearly succeeded. But tonight, we are going to find her. Close your eyes, or don't. Let your body go heavy wherever you are. Because we are leaving the present behind tonight, and the journey is a long one. We are going back 3,500 years, across an ocean of time so vast that most of the civilizations you learnt about in school had not yet been imagined. We are going back to a city on the banks of the Nile, in a valley ringed by pale limestone cliffs, in a palace that smelled of Kiphi incense and warm stone, and the river. We are going to Thebes. It is sometime around the year 1507, before the Common Era. The Nile is in flood, that extraordinary annual event when the river rises from its bed and spills across the fields of Egypt, depositing the rich black silt that makes this narrow strip of land along the water's edge the most fertile agricultural ground in the ancient world. The air is thick and warm, carrying the smell of wet earth and papyrus reeds and something sweet that you cannot quite name but that the people who live here have known their whole lives. The sound of the water is constant, low, patient, indifferent. The river has been doing this for thousands of years before anyone was alive to hear it, and it will continue long after the last pharaoh is dust. Into this world, in this palace, a child is born. Her father is Thutmose I, a warrior pharaoh of fierce intelligence and enormous ambition. A man who has already pushed the borders of the Egyptian empire north into the Levant and south deep into the black granite hills of Nubia. His soldiers would follow him into any darkness. His enemies look at his armies and choose, wisely, to negotiate. He walks through the world as if the gods themselves have agreed to step aside and let him pass. His daughter, born to his great royal wife, a woman named Ahmose, enters that world with dark eyes that see everything. She is named Hatshepsut. The name means foremost of the noble ladies. She will spend the rest of her life making that name mean something that no one, in the moment she was given it, could have anticipated. From her earliest years, Hatshepsut is different in the way that truly exceptional people are always different. Not louder, not more demanding, not more dramatic. Different in a quieter and more unsettling way. She watches, she listens, she reads the hieroglyphic texts that most children of her age and rank are still struggling to recognize. She accompanies her father to ceremonies that daughters are not normally permitted to witness. And she stands perfectly still in those sacred spaces, taking everything in with an expression that the priests around her cannot quite read. Is she afraid? No. Is she awed? Perhaps. But more than anything, she looks like someone who is filing information away for future use. Her father notices. You do not raise a child of that quality without noticing. He brings her more often into the rituals of the court. He lets her stand beside him in the temple of Amun at Karnak, where the incense smoke rises in pale curling columns toward the ceiling, and the chanting of the priests fills the stone space like water filling a bowl. Some ancient sources, though they are disputed, suggest that Thutmose I formally introduced his daughter as his intended heir. If true, it was a revolutionary act. It was also, ultimately, an impossible one, because the court knew what Egypt could and could not accept. And in the year 1507, before the Common Era, Egypt was not ready for a female pharaoh. Not yet. But here is what I haven't told you yet. And this is the part that changes everything about the story. Egypt being not ready, and Hatshepsut accepting that those were never going to be the same thing. The marriage happened when Hatshepsut was still young, perhaps 12, perhaps a little older. Her husband was a boy named Thutmose II, her half-brother, the son of Thutmose I by a lesser wife, a woman whose name the official records treat with polite minimalism. In the logic of the Egyptian royal court, this marriage was practically inevitable. It was not designed for love, though love, occasionally, was what royal couples found. It was designed for stability. Hatshepsut's bloodline was purer. As the daughter of the great royal wife, she held the highest possible hereditary status. Thutmose II, by marrying her, made his claim to the throne unassailable, and by accepting the marriage, Hatshepsut moved into the most prestigious female position in the most powerful kingdom on earth, Great Royal Wife. It was not a small title. It was, in fact, the highest a woman in Egypt could officially hold. But it was not the double crown. And Hatshepsut knew the difference. Picture her at that ceremony, standing in the center of an enormous ritual that has been planned for months by priests and administrators and artists and scribes. The hall is full of light, oil lamps and candles casting a warm, unsteady glow across painted columns. Important people are watching from every angle. Her face is perfectly composed. Her hands are still. She is thinking. Thutmose II was, by all accounts, not the pharaoh his father had been. The ancient texts describe his reign with a careful neutrality that historians have learned to recognize as coded disappointment. He campaigned here and there, the suppression of revolt in Nubia, some activity in the south, but without the driving intensity that had characterized his father's rule. He built some things, he made decisions, he existed. The medical evidence suggests he was not a healthy man. The mummy identified as Thutmose II shows signs of skin disease and physical frailty. He probably died in his early 30s, possibly younger. The body simply gave out. He left behind a son, not Hatshepsut's son, but a boy born to a lesser wife, a secondary queen named Iset. The boy's name was Thutmose III. He was perhaps 3 years old, perhaps less. The sources disagree on the specifics. What they agree on is this: an infant cannot rule the most powerful empire in the ancient world. Someone had to step in. Hatshepsut was named regent. The official title was measured, careful, traditional. She would manage the affairs of state until the child was old enough to assume power. She would hold the administrative machinery together. She would conduct foreign relations, manage the treasury, make the decisions that kept Egypt fed and protected and stable. She would do all of this as the power behind the throne. Not the pharaoh, never the pharaoh. That role belonged to the boy. This was the role they gave her. I want you to breathe for a moment. Let your body sink a little heavier into wherever you are resting, because what I am about to tell you is the part of the story that no one who arranged that regency saw coming. Hatshepsut had spent her entire life watching how power worked. She had walked those palace corridors since she could walk. She had attended ceremonies at the highest levels of Egyptian society since childhood. She had studied the administrative records of previous reigns. She understood with a precision that was almost architectural in its quality, exactly how the structures of Egyptian power were built, where they were strong and where they could be moved. And she had been planning. Quietly for years, she had been planning. The moment they handed her the regency, she began. No historian can tell you the exact date. There is no single inscription that marks the moment of transition with a clean line. That is partly because it was not, in truth, a single moment. It was a process. Careful, deliberate, and over a period of years so methodical that it is difficult even now to identify where it began and where it became irreversible. But somewhere around the 7th year of the regency, give or take a season, the images begin to change. In the wall paintings and temple reliefs commissioned by the royal court, a figure that had been consistently depicted in the white linen robes of a queen begins, gradually to appear in different clothing. The cart headdress, the shendit kilt, the crook and flail crossed over the chest and attached below the chin by 2 thin golden straps, the divine false beard, the ceremonial beard worn by every pharaoh in Egypt's history, male or female, as a mark of their divine authority. The hieroglyphs beside this figure no longer say great royal wife. They say something that no woman had said of herself in Egypt's living memory. They say, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Lord of the 2 lands, daughter of Ra. Hatshepsut had taken the throne. She did not do this violently. There were no soldiers at midnight, no blood on the palace stairs, no screaming in the corridors. This was not a coup in the conventional sense. It was something more sophisticated and, in many respects, more remarkable. It was a political masterwork executed with the calm confidence of someone who has been thinking about nothing else for years. The key was the Temple of Amun. In ancient Egypt, the great religious establishment was not separate from political power. It was one of the central pillars of it. The priests of Amun at Karnak controlled enormous wealth, extensive lands, a vast network of subordinate temples, and most importantly, the divine legitimacy that a pharaoh required to rule. Without the support of the priesthood, the double crown was just metal. With it, a pharaoh was a god made flesh. Hatshepsut secured that support. How? She gave them a story carved in stone, painted in vivid color, told in exquisite detail on the walls of her greatest temple. And that story began, as Egyptian creation stories always began, with a god. And what happened next in that story is something I have not told you yet, because it requires its own darkness, its own space, its own careful telling. But first, are you comfortable? Has your breathing slowed? Good, because we are going deeper into the stone now. And the deeper we go, the older the world becomes around us. The story Hatshepsut told about herself went like this. At the moment of her conception, the great god Amun, lord of Thebes, king of the gods, the hidden one, whose name meant both wind and breath, and something beyond either, left his divine realm and descended to the earth. He disguised himself. He took the form of Thutmose I, the pharaoh, Hatshepsut's mortal father, and in that form he came to Queen Ahmose in the night. The ancient text on the wall of Deir el-Bahri describes the meeting in terms that are surprisingly tender for a political document. It speaks of the god's fragrance filling the room like the scent of punt, that faraway paradise of myrrh and incense. It speaks of the queen waking and being overwhelmed not with fear but with wonder, recognizing in that moment that what was before her was not her husband but something immeasurably greater. From that divine union, a child was conceived, and that child, shaped by the gods themselves on the potter's wheel of creation, breathed into existence by the sacred breath of Amun, declared before birth to be the one chosen to sit upon the throne of Horus, was Hatshepsut. She was not, the story said, merely a woman who had seized power. She was the daughter of a god. She had been meant for this from before her first breath. The throne was not something she had claimed. It was something she had been given, at the moment of her creation, by the highest power in the Egyptian universe. This was not a modest claim. It was not designed to be modest. In the logic of ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh was literally divine, not metaphorically divine, not symbolically divine, but actually ontologically, in their essential nature, divine, this was the only claim that would work. Half measures would not have been sufficient. A woman asking to rule because she was capable would have been dismissed. A woman revealing that she had always been the chosen one of the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon, that was a different argument entirely, and the priests of Amun accepted it. Which means either that they believed it, or that they found it advantageous to behave as if they did, and in the practical world of ancient Egyptian politics, the distinction was never as clear as we might like. With divine legitimacy secured, Hatshepsut moved to make her position concrete in every other dimension available to her. She appointed loyal officials to key administrative positions. She built alliances with generals and governors. She began the building program that would occupy the rest of her reign and leave marks on the physical landscape of Egypt that would survive for thousands of years. She was pharaoh now. Fully, officially, unambiguously pharaoh. And she intended to be the best one Egypt had ever seen. But what did best mean to her? What kind of pharaoh was she, when the crown was finally on her head? I have not told you that part yet. And it is, in many ways, the most extraordinary part of all. She built. That is the essential fact of her reign, the axis around which everything else turns. Where other pharaohs recorded their greatness through military conquest, through lists of cities taken and enemies slain and tribute extracted from foreign peoples, Hatshepsut recorded hers in architecture, in monuments, in stone so massive and so precisely worked that it has outlasted not just her empire but every empire that came after it. Her building program was staggering in its scale. Across the length of the Nile Valley, from the delta in the north to the far reaches of Nubia in the south, she commissioned temples, sanctuaries, shrines, pylons, and obelisks with an energy that suggests someone who was acutely aware of how limited her time might be, someone who was building not just for the present but against the future, knowing that the future is always uncertain and the stone is always more reliable than the living. At Karnak, the greatest religious complex in the ancient world, a temple city that had been growing for centuries and would continue to grow for centuries more. So vast that the Cathedral of Notre Dame could fit inside its hypostyle hall with room to spare. Hatshepsut left some of her most dramatic marks. She built a series of structures within the Karnak complex that expanded and enriched the temple in ways that her successors, including the ones who tried to erase her, would eventually co-opt and incorporate into their own building programs, unable to destroy them because they were too structurally integral to what stood around them. And she raised the obelisks, 2 of them, in the inner sanctuary of the temple, in a location so sacred that only the highest priests were normally permitted to enter, each one carved from a single piece of pink Aswan granite, an engineering achievement that required quarrying the stone hundreds of miles to the south, transporting it on boats up the Nile, and positioning it with a precision that modern engineers still find impressive, each one standing roughly 30 meters, nearly 100 feet, from the desert floor to its pyramidal tip, and each one sheathed, from tip to base, in electrum. Electrum is an alloy of gold and silver that occurs naturally in certain Egyptian mining regions. It is pale gold in color, warmer than silver, cooler than pure gold, and when the sun strikes it at the right angle, it blazes with a light that is almost impossible to look at directly. In the morning, when the sun came over the eastern hills and hit those obelisk tips, they burned. They could be seen from the far side of the Nile, from miles away, from distances that made the obelisks themselves invisible. You could see the light they threw. Hatshepsut knew exactly what she was doing. She wrote about it herself. On the body of the obelisks, in hieroglyphs that she composed in her own voice, first person, direct, personal, she described her intentions. She wrote about her love for Ammon, her gratitude for his favor, her desire to create something worthy of his greatness. And she used a word that Egyptian royal inscriptions almost never used: loving. She described her heart as loving. She called herself a son, because the language required a son, because every pharaonic formula for 3,000 years had been written in the masculine, and she chose to make the language accommodate her rather than the other way round. But she put a human word inside the formal language, a word with warmth in it. That tells you something about who she was. Inside the monument and the title and the divine birth story, it tells you that the person who ordered those obelisks was not just a political strategist. She was someone who felt things, who found meaning in the rituals she performed and the God she served, who loved in her own formidable way. And now, I need to tell you about what she built across the river. Because compared to the obelisks were almost modest. Jezeru. Say it slowly if you like. The syllables are round and soft. Drezeru. The holiest of holies. The most sacred of sacred places. This was the name Hatshepsut gave to her mortuary temple. And it was not a name chosen for humility. Go with me to the west bank of the Nile. This is the side of the river where the sun sets, and in Egyptian cosmology, where the sun went at the end of each day, was also where the dead went at the end of each life. The West Bank was the land of the dead, or rather, the land of the transformed dead. The people who had passed through the 12 hours of the night in the underworld and emerged, if they had lived rightly and spoken the correct words and had their hearts weighed against the feather of truth, into something eternal. Here, in a natural bay in the limestone cliffs, as if the rock itself had arranged to create a stage. Hatshepsut built Thebes. It is not a single building. It rises in 3 terraced levels, each level a colonnaded portico of squared limestone columns that cast long rectangular shadows in the afternoon heat. The levels are connected by long ramps of gentle gradient, designed so that the approach to the sanctuary is gradual, a slow ascent that mirrors the journey from the human world into the divine one. The orientation is precise. The temple faces east, toward the Nile and toward the rising sun, so that at certain times of year, the dawn light enters the innermost sanctuary and illuminates the statue of Ammon with a precision that can only have been intentional. She built gardens on those terraces. Exotic trees. We will come to how she got them. Planted in round holes cut into the bedrock and filled with imported soil. Pools of water reflecting the pale limestone cliffs. Birds, perhaps. the kind of abundant sensory richness that Egyptian temple gardens were designed to provide. A taste of paradise, a foretaste of the eternal garden that awaited the righteous dead. On the interior walls of the temple, Hatshepsut told her story. The divine birth sequence, with Ammon visiting Amos in the night. The procession of gods celebrating the birth of the chosen child. The coronation, the religious ceremonies, and one more story. The most remarkable one. The one that even her enemies could not bring themselves to erase completely because it was too large, too detailed, too essentially woven into the fabric of the temple to remove without destroying the building itself. The story of the expedition to a place the Egyptians called Ta-Nejer, the land of the gods, Punt. And that is a story that deserves its own darkness, its own telling. Because what she did with those ships, what she brought back from the edge of the known world, is one of the most extraordinary acts of ambition in 3,000 years of Egyptian history. But first, are you still with me? Has the day loosened its grip a little more? Good. Let your breath go slower. Let the weight of the present moment ease. We have further to go tonight, and the next part of the story is the most vivid of all. Punt was not a myth. We know this now, though for a long time scholars debated it. Modern archaeology has identified Ta-Nejer, the land of the gods, with a region somewhere in the Horn of Africa, probably around what is now Eritrea, Djibouti, or the northern coast of Somalia. The Egyptians had traded with Punt in earlier periods of their history, during the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. But the roots had been forgotten and the knowledge had faded, and by the time Hatshepsut sat on the throne, Punt had become the kind of place that people talked about in the same breath as paradise. Real, probably, but so distant and so difficult to reach that it existed primarily as a concept of abundance and wonder. She sent ships there, not cautiously, not minimally. 5 large ships, vessels of a size and construction that represented a serious investment of Egyptian resources, loaded with trade goods and manned by soldiers and sailors and royal envoys carrying the authority of the pharaoh herself. They were to sail south through the Red Sea, navigate whatever lay beyond, find Punt, trade with its people, and bring back proof that the world was larger than it remembered. The Red Sea is not a gentle body of water. Its winds are unpredictable, its reefs are hidden, and its shores, at least on the western side, offer little reliable shelter for ships in trouble. The sailors who made this journey knew the risks. The soldiers aboard knew them too, and yet they went, because the pharaoh had commanded it, and because perhaps they were curious. Because Punt was a story their grandparents had told them, and they were going to find out if the story was true. It was true. Beyond the sea, they found a coastline different from anything in Egypt. Green, humid, thick with trees they had no names for. They found a people who were surprised to see them, and who initially approached with a combination of wariness and hospitality that the Egyptians found reassuring. They found, in this distant and half-legendary place, exactly what the ancient texts had promised: mirror trees. Not the dried resin that Egypt used in enormous quantities for temple incense, but living trees, 31 of them, with roots wrapped carefully in baskets of their native soil, ready to be transported across the sea and planted in the terraced gardens of Deir el-Bahari. Heaps of dried myrrh resin, fragrant and preserving, worth its weight in almost any commodity Egypt produced. Ebony wood, dark and heavy, for furniture and inlay work. Ivory, gold, cinnamon, greyhounds, monkeys. The skin of a leopard, spotted and glossy, and incense, sacred incense, the smoke of which was believed to carry prayers from the human world to the divine one. The expedition loaded all of this onto the 5 ships and sailed home. They arrived in Thebes to what can only be described as triumph. The images on the walls of Deir el-Bahari show the return in exhaustive, joyful detail. The ships heavy in the water with their cargo, the sailors grinning, the exotic animals on the deck, the trees in their baskets, and Hatshepsut herself receiving the tribute, standing before the offerings of a world that had not been reached in living memory. Her posture, that of someone who has just done exactly what she intended to do, and is not particularly surprised that it worked. She had reached further than any pharaoh before her. She had brought back a piece of paradise and planted it, literally, in her garden. The walls of her temple say this, in case anyone was uncertain about the significance of the achievement. Never was brought the like of this for any king who has been since the beginning. Never was brought the like of this. Who was the person capable of standing in a temple she had built and writing in stone for eternity? No one before me has done this. Someone who believed it was true. Someone who had the evidence to prove it. But there is a part of this story I have not touched yet. A figure who moves through the background of Hatshepsut's reign like a shadow, appearing and disappearing in the record. His exact nature and his exact relationship to the pharaoh, among the most debated questions in all of Egyptology. His name was Senenmut, and his story is stranger and sadder and more human than almost anything else in this history. He came from nowhere that the records care to acknowledge. His parents' names are known. A man named Ramos and a woman named Hatnefret. Provincial people, unremarkable by the standards of the royal court. How Senenmut entered the orbit of the palace is not entirely clear. What is clear is that by the early years of Hatshepsut's reign, he had become indispensable. His titles accumulated like rings on a tree, each one recording a new expansion of his role and his trust. Steward of Ammon, steward of the queen, chief steward of the king, tutor to the royal princess Neferura, overseer of all the works of the king, overseer of the granaries of Ammon, overseer of the fields, gardens, cattle and fowl of the divine offerings. By the time his titles are fully listed in the ancient record, he controlled an astonishing proportion of the administrative and economic machinery of the Egyptian state. He was, in practical terms, the second most powerful person in Egypt. And he was not royal. He was not a general. He was a commoner who had risen by nothing but intelligence, competence and, clearly, the profound and sustained trust of the woman who ruled the empire. He was her architect, in the broadest possible sense, not just the supervisor of her building programs, though that role alone would have been enormous, but the person who translated her vision into physical reality. The obelisks at Karnak were raised under his coordination. The terraced structure of Deir el-Bahri, with its innovative three-tiered design, was executed under his direction. He was the mechanism by which Hatshepsut's ambitions became monuments. And there is the question of what else he was. The ancient Egyptians had a tradition of satirical art, drawings and sketches found in workers' villages and on the reverse sides of papyri. Images that show animals acting like humans or important figures in undignified situations. Some of the graffiti found in the cliffs near Thebes depicts what appears to be a figure in a position of intimate proximity with a figure wearing a crown. The images are crude and deliberately ambiguous, but Egyptologists have argued for generations about what they mean and about who the figures are meant to represent. There is also this. In certain carefully chosen locations within the temple of Deir el-Bahri, in niches behind doors, in corners that would only be visible to someone who knew exactly where to look, Senenmut had his own image placed, not prominently, not in the center of the walls, surrounded by divine imagery, hidden, like a private joke, or a private prayer, or a private declaration of belonging. Hatshepsut permitted this. She knew it was there. In Egypt, including one's image in a temple was to be included in the eternal rituals performed there. To receive, symbolically, the divine nourishment of the offerings. To be remembered in the sacred space. To put his image in her temple was to intertwine their eternities. Whether their relationship was something beyond professional is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. The ancient record declines to be definitive, as it so often does when the truth might be complicated. What we know is that sometime around the 20th year of Hatshepsut's reign, not long before the end, Senenmut disappears from the record. No final inscription, no tomb found completed, no record of his death, just silence, where there had been a voice. Something happened. We do not know what, and that silence is one of the most haunting details in a story full of haunting details. But here is what I need to tell you now. Because Senenmut's disappearance is not the most haunting thing about Hatshepsut's story. The most haunting thing is what happened after she herself was gone. After the last lamp was extinguished in Djeser-Djeseru. After the double crown was placed on a different head. After the erasure began. Around the year 1458. Before the Common Era, Hatshepsut died. She was probably in her early 50s, which in the ancient world was a meaningful lifespan. Not extraordinary, but substantial. She had been pharaoh, in the full sense, for approximately 22 years. Before that, regent for several more. She had spent the better part of 3 decades at the top of the most complex administrative and religious hierarchy in the ancient world. The circumstances of her death are unknown. The mummy identified as hers shows evidence of diabetes, bone cancer, arthritis, and severe dental disease, possibly the result of a medicated skin lotion she applied regularly that contained benzopirin, a known carcinogen. She was not in perfect health in her final years. She was in pain, probably, moving through her days with the quiet endurance that people in chronic pain develop, a kind of relationship with discomfort that does not stop you, but that is always there, always present, always requiring management. She was buried in the Valley of the Kings, the sacred valley across the Nile from Thebes, where the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom were interred in tombs cut deep into the limestone bedrock. Her tomb, designated KV20 by modern archaeologists, was one of the deepest and most complex in the valley. It was prepared for 2 burials, herself and her father Thutmose I, whose remains she had reinterred there when the tomb was complete. It was her final act of piety to the man who had, in his own complicated way, prepared her for everything that followed. She was buried with canopic jars and amulets and shabti figures and spells from the Book of the Dead. She was buried with the provisions and the objects and the words that an Egyptian of the highest rank required for the journey through the underworld. She was buried with the full ceremony and the full solemnity that a pharaoh deserved. And in a royal storeroom somewhere in the valley, a small wooden box was placed. Inside it, a mummified liver and a single human tooth. She would not know, could not have known, what significance that box would carry. 3,500 years later, how the most ordinary of objects, saved perhaps from a painful dental procedure, would become the key that unlocked her identity from the silence that was coming. The silence had already begun. Thutmose III, the boy she had effectively governed beside for 22 years, the nominal co-pharaoh who had grown, in the shadow of her reign, into a man of formidable ability, was now sole ruler of Egypt. He would go on to become one of the greatest military pharaohs in the empire's long history. He would campaign 17 times in 20 years. He would push the borders of Egypt to their greatest extent ever. He would be called, by later historians, the Napoleon of the ancient world. He was capable of anything. And somewhere between the 18th and 20th year of his solo reign, he proved it. This is the part of the story that is hardest to hold in the mind. Not because it is complicated, but because of its scale, because of its patience, because of the sheer sustained determination required to do what was done to Hatshepsut's memory, and because of how close it came to working. Someone, and for simplicity, we will say Thutmose III, though some scholars argue it may have been his son Amenhotep II, acting for dynastic reasons of his own, began systematically removing Hatshepsut from the Egyptian record. Not one wall, not one temple. Everywhere. At Karnak, workers were organized and deployed to climb scaffolding to the height of the great obelisks and fill in the hieroglyphic inscriptions with plaster, covering Hatshepsut's name and her image, while leaving the obelisks themselves standing, because destroying 40-foot granite pillars was beyond even a pharaoh's logistical capacity. Then, around the lower portions of the obelisks, a stone wall was constructed, so that even the base of the obelisks, the section that a person at ground level could most easily read, was hidden. The electrum tips still blazed at the top, but the name below was gone. At Deir el-Bahari, the destruction was more intimate, and in some ways more devastating. The painted reliefs on the interior walls, those vivid, detailed images of Hatshepsut's life and reign and divine birth, were systematically attacked. Every face was chiseled out. Every cartouche bearing her name was cut away. The images of her body were removed and replaced, sometimes with the images of her male predecessors, Thutmose I, Thutmose II, as if they had been there all along and she had been the mistake, the gap in the record that was only now being corrected. Her statues, and there were hundreds of them, placed throughout temple complexes across Egypt, depicting her in every pose that a pharaoh might assume, seated, striding, kneeling in offering, sphinx form with a lion's body and her serene face, were pulled from their positions. Smashed, the fragments were carried to a pit near the site of Deir el-Bahari and buried. Not thrown in the Nile, buried. This detail matters. In Egyptian belief, the image of a person was connected to the Ka, the spirit, the essential animating force that survived death. To destroy an image completely was to do harm to the soul it represented. Even in erasing her, whoever ordered the erasure was unwilling, or perhaps afraid to destroy entirely. The images were hidden rather than obliterated, as if some corner of the mind doing the erasing retained, despite everything, a vestigial awareness that Hatshepsut was real, that she had been powerful, that the gods might have opinions about what was being done to her, or perhaps it was simply bureaucratic. Bury the evidence. It is safer than scattering it. From the official lists of pharaohs maintained by the royal court and the temple archives, her name was removed. When the later Egyptians, the priests and scribes who maintained the historical records that subsequent dynasties would rely on, compiled their accounts of who had ruled Egypt, and in what succession, there was a gap where Hatshepsut had been. Thutmose I, Thutmose II, then nothing, then Thutmose III. She had been edited out. She had been made to not have existed, and for 3,000 years, nearly, the erasure held, but stones remember. And the people who ordered the erasure made one mistake. A mistake so large, so structural, so impossible to correct, that it doomed their entire effort from the beginning. They could not unmake Djeru. They could damage it. They could chip away the faces. They could cover the names. But they could not make the building itself not exist. And a building of that beauty and that ambition, standing at the base of those cliffs, visible from across the Nile, a building like that does not allow itself to be forgotten. It asks questions. It demands answers. And 3,000 years later, someone finally came looking. The sand moved in. That was the first thing. After the priests stopped maintaining the rituals, after the new kingdom ended, and the dynasties that came after had their own concerns and their own gods and their own building programs, the desert moved into the abandoned spaces. Sand filled the colonnades of Deir el-Bahari. It drifted across the painted reliefs on the interior walls, settling into the carved grooves of the hieroglyphs, coating everything in a fine, pale layer that was, ironically, precisely what those paintings needed to survive. Protected from light, from moisture, from the hands of visitors, the images beneath the sand kept their color. In certain sections, when archaeologists eventually brushed the sand away, the paint was as vivid as it had been when the artists applied it. Deep red, lapis blue, malachite green, the warm ochre of Egyptian flesh tones. 3,500 years. The paint survived 3,500 years because someone buried her under sand. Meanwhile, the world changed beyond recognition. Egypt was conquered by Assyria, then by Persia. Then in the 4th century before the Common Era, Alexander the Great rode out of Macedonia with an army that had already crossed the known world, and Egypt opened its ancient gates. The Egyptians, pragmatic as always, recognized genius when they saw it, and made Alexander a pharaoh. He left an officer named Ptolemy to govern after him, and the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, until Cleopatra, the last of her line, watched the Roman legions arrive and made her final calculations. Then came Rome. Then the slow dissolution of the old religion as Christianity spread through the empire. The temples of the Egyptian gods were closed, their rituals forbidden, their hieroglyphic script forgotten so completely that within a few generations no one living could read it. The texts on the walls of the great temples became unreadable, patterns of symbol that preserved their meaning perfectly, but had no one left to unlock them. Hatshepsut was doubly buried. Once under the deliberate plaster and chisel of her erasers, once under the simple passing of time. In the Valley of the Kings, the tomb robbers came, as they always did. Within a few centuries of the pharaoh's burials, whatever had been placed in Hatshepsut's tomb for her eternal comfort was long gone before any archaeologist would ever think to look. The mummies themselves, displaced and moved, and sometimes damaged, ended up in caches and hiding places that preserved them through luck rather than intention. One mummy ended up in a tomb designated KV60 by modern archaeologists. A small, unremarkable space, not a royal tomb at all in its design, Two female mummies had been found there when the tomb was first entered in 1903. One was removed to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The other, for reasons that are not entirely clear, possibly because she seemed relatively unimportant, was left behind. Left on the floor, in the dark, alone, for 100 years more. And in a museum storeroom in Cairo, a wooden box sat on a shelf, catalogued and largely forgotten, containing the objects that Howard Carter had found in a royal storeroom in 1903, a mummified liver and a tooth. These two things, the mummy on the floor and the tooth in the box, were waiting for each other. They had been waiting for 100 years after being found, and for 3,000 years before that. In 2006, they finally met. But I want to tell you who found them first, because the story of how Hatshepsut was rediscovered is itself a detective story. A slow, collaborative, century-long process that involved dozens of scholars across multiple countries and generations, working with tools that ranged from magnifying glasses and hand-drawn tracings to CT scanners and genetic analysis, all trying to read a record that had been deliberately made unreadable. The story of Hatshepsut's rediscovery begins in the 19th century, with the general explosion of European interest in ancient Egypt that followed Napoleon's expedition, and the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone. By mid-century, scholars could read hieroglyphs again. The knowledge lost for 1,500 years had been recovered in a few decades of brilliant collective effort, and they could begin to read the walls of the temples that had been standing, largely ignored for millennia. What they found at Dir al-Bahri was perplexing. The temple was clearly extraordinary. Its architecture was unlike anything else in Egypt. Later scholars would call it the earliest example of an architecture of terracing and colonnading that would not appear again in the Mediterranean world for 1,000 years. But the inscriptions was contradictory. Images had been damaged. Names had been changed. Someone had clearly been there before, altering the record, and the identity of the person being erased was not immediately clear. Egyptologists in the latter half of the 19th century began piecing together the puzzle. In 1894, Edouard Neville led an excavation of Deir el-Bahari that produced detailed records of the temple's painted scenes, including the divine birth sequence and the expedition to Punt. The outlines of a remarkable story began to emerge, but the protagonist was not yet fully visible. The name had been removed in too many places. It was Howard Carter, a young archaeological draftsman working with Neville, who would later become famous for discovering the tomb of Tutankhamun, who in the early years of the 20th century helped push the reconstruction further. And it was the American Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, in his monumental History of Egypt, published in 1905, who first drew public attention to the scale of what had been found. A female pharaoh, deliberately erased, whose reign had been one of the most remarkable in Egyptian history. But the identification was incomplete. The body, the woman herself, physical and specific and irreducible, was missing, until the box was opened. In 2006, the Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, then Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities and one of the most prominent figures in modern Egyptology, turned his attention to the small wooden box that had been sitting in the Cairo Museum since 1903. It bore Hatshepsut's name. It contained a mummified liver and a single molar tooth. Simultaneously, another team was re-examining the mummy left on the floor of KV-60. CT scanning technology, which had become available to archaeologists in the early 2000s, allowed them to examine the mummy's jaw in extraordinary detail, to map the sockets where teeth had been lost during the woman's lifetime, and identify precisely which teeth were missing. The molar in the box matched a socket in the jaw of the KV-60 mummy with a precision that left no reasonable doubt. The woman on the floor, fat, elderly, her arm positioned in the royal pose across her chest, lying in the dark with her arm in the position that indicated she had once been someone of the highest importance, was Hatshepsut. She had been found. Zahi Hawass made the announcement to the assembled international press on June 27, 2006. For a day or two, her name was on the front pages of newspapers in 40 countries. People who had never thought about ancient Egypt found themselves reading about a woman who had ruled an empire 3,500 years ago and had nearly been erased from history. Nearly, but not quite, because the stone held. And now, tonight, you know her name. There is a question that archaeology can get close to but never fully answer. The question of interiority, of what it was like to be inside a particular life. We can reconstruct the events and the monuments and the political maneuvers and the physical evidence. We cannot reconstruct the experience. But sometimes, in the ancient record, there are moments when the formal language of official inscription drops its guard. Just slightly, and something personal comes through. Something that feels less like a document and more like a person. On the obelisks at Karnak, Hatshepsut wrote, "I have done this with a loving heart for my father Amun." Loving. The word in Egyptian is ib, which is also the word for heart and for mind and for the seat of the personality. A loving heart is a heart that is engaged, invested, present. It is the opposite of the dutiful, mechanical performance of ritual obligation. She was not erecting those obelisks because it was expected of her. She was erecting them because she wanted to. She spoke of Amun as her father, in terms that go beyond the official claim of divine parentage. The god was real to her. The relationship was real. In a world where the distinction between the religious and the political was practically speaking non-existent, this means that her faith and her ambition and her sense of divine mission were not three separate things but one thing, a unified sense of purpose that was expressed through everything she did. She believed she was chosen. She built accordingly. Was she kind? Was she cruel? Was she afraid? Ever? Did she have moments of doubt? Moments in the small hours of the morning when the palace was quiet and the Nile was murmuring, and the weight of what she had claimed pressed down and asked to be validated. We do not know. We will not know. But we know that she did not stop. She did not retreat into ceremony and leave the hard decisions to others. She was active to the end of her reign, building, commissioning, managing, deciding. The records of her final years show a pharaoh still fully engaged with the work of governing, still signing off on building projects and administrative decisions, still present and in command. Whatever she felt in those quiet hours, she did not let it slow her down. There is also this. She chose, among all the stories she could have told on the walls of her temple, to tell the story of the expedition to Punt. She could have filled those walls with military campaigns, with the conventional imagery of a pharaoh smiting his enemies. She chose instead to tell the story of a journey to a distant and wonderful place, of trees brought home across an ocean, of a world made larger by reach and curiosity. That is a choice that tells you something about what she valued, about what she wanted to be remembered for. She wanted to be remembered as the pharaoh who made the world larger, and in ways she could never have anticipated, in ways that required a tooth in a wooden box and a CT scanner 3,000 years after her death. She was, why did Thutmose III erase her? This is the question that refuses to settle. The more you look at it, the more complex it becomes, and the more interesting and the more human. The simple answer is resentment. He had been denied the throne for 22 years by a woman who was not his mother. He had grown up watching someone else wear the crown that, in the conventional logic of succession, should have been his from childhood. When she died and he was finally sole ruler, he expressed that resentment in stone by removing her from stone. That story is satisfying. It is clean. It fits the shape of a comprehensible human emotion. But the evidence does not entirely support it. The erasure was not immediate. After Hatshepsut's death, approximately 18 to 20 years passed before the systematic removal of her images began. 18 to 20 years of Thutmose III ruling Egypt as its sole, unchallenged pharaoh, building his own monuments, conducting his famous military campaigns, establishing his own legacy, and leaving hers intact. If the erasure was personal, why wait 20 years? The most compelling modern interpretation is not about rage, but about administration, about succession planning, about the desire of a pharaoh to provide his son, Amenhotep II, approaching adulthood and beginning to assume an increasingly prominent role with a clean and comprehensible narrative of legitimate royal inheritance. In that narrative, a female pharaoh, who had ruled between two male ones, was a complication. She disrupted the clean father-to-son line of divine inheritance that the Egyptian royal ideology depended on. She raised questions about precedent. She might, if her memory remained prominent, raise questions in the mind of a young prince about whether female rule was in fact possible, whether it had precedent, whether someone might attempt it again. By removing her from the record, Thutmose III was not necessarily expressing personal hatred. He was doing something more bureaucratic, and in some ways more disturbing. He was simplifying the historical record for political purposes. He was editing the past to produce a cleaner future. This happened. It has happened many times since, in many different cultures and many different political systems. The instinct to control the past in order to control the present and the future is not unique to ancient Egypt. It is a human instinct, and it does not always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from the desire for order, for clarity, for a story that is easier to tell to children. Hatshepsut's story was complicated, so they took it out, but here is what they did not account for. Here is the error in their calculation. They did not account for the stone, and they did not account for the tooth, and they did not account for the 3,500 years of time that would pass between the erasure and the present moment, during which the human desire to understand the past would grow rather than diminish. They did not account for curiosity, for the simple, stubborn human need to know what actually happened, and that need, that curiosity, is why we are here tonight. In the dark, together, telling a story that someone tried very hard to make untellable. What else, I wonder, is still buried? What other stories are under the sand, waiting for someone to open the right box? In the centuries after Hatshepsut's erasure, there were other women who ruled Egypt, or came close to ruling it. Nefertiti, the queen of the revolutionary pharaoh Akhenaten, whose role in the heretical Aten religion, and whose possible brief reign as a pharaoh in her own right, is still debated by scholars. Tusret, who ruled briefly at the end of the 19th dynasty, and much later, in the Ptolemaic period, the queen who has overshadowed all of them in popular imagination, Cleopatra. Each of them navigated the same fundamental tension, the tension between the rules of the system and the requirements of the moment, the tension between what was officially possible for a woman and what was practically necessary. We do not know if any of them knew about Hatshepsut. By the Ptolemaic period, the hieroglyphs on the walls of Deir el-Bahri were still readable, but the name they spelled had been damaged in so many places that her identity was obscured. The tradition of her, if it persisted at all, would have been oral, unofficial, transmitted in the way that suppressed histories are always transmitted, quietly, privately, in places where the official record does not reach. Women talk. In every culture, in every period of history, women have talked to each other and to their children in spaces that official records do not capture. The oral tradition that preserves unofficial history is almost always women's work. The grandmothers who remember what the monuments have been told to forget, perhaps somewhere in ancient Thebes, after the erasure but before the final collapse of the old religion. A grandmother told a granddaughter there was a woman, once. She wore the double crown. She built the white temple that you can see from across the river. She sent ships to a place called Punton, brought back living trees, and the trees grew in the gardens of the temple for years. Perhaps, we cannot know. What we know is that the memory was not entirely suppressed. It was buried, like the statues, like the name in the plaster, like the mummy in the forgotten tomb. But buried things do not disappear. They wait. And the waiting ended in 2006, in a fluorescent-lit room in a Cairo museum, with a tooth and a CT scanner and an Egyptian archaeologist who asked the right question. She came back. She came back because human curiosity is more durable than human power, and because the need to know what actually happened is deeper than the desire to control what is remembered. She came back because she had built too much to vanish. There is still one of Hatshepsut's obelisks standing at Karnak. The other fell at some point in the centuries since it was raised. It toppled, and it lies now on its side near the sanctuary, where it once blazed in the morning light. But one stands. 30 meters of pink Aswan granite, still pointing upward, still carrying on its surface the hieroglyphs that describe the pharaoh who raised it, and the god she raised it for. The electrum is long gone, stripped away at some point in the ancient past. The gold too valuable to be left decorating a monument when armies needed to be paid. The tip is bare now, granite against the Egyptian sky, but the obelisk stands. You can go there. You can stand at the base of it and put your hand on the granite and feel 35 centuries of weather in the texture of the stone. You can look up and see, still readable to anyone who knows the hieroglyphic script, the name that someone spent enormous resources trying to make unreadable. You can look up and read, Martkara, the great name, the throne name of the pharaoh. She chose that name herself. Mart is the goddess of truth and cosmic order. Ka is the divine spirit. Ra is the sun. Together, the Ka of Ra is Mart. The spirit of the sun is truth. The truth spirit of the sun. That was what she called herself when she took the double crown. That was the identity she chose when the language required her to name herself as a god. The truth, the spirit, the sun, and she is still there. On that stone, in the morning light that comes over the eastern hills and falls across the surface of the obelisk. Exactly as it fell the first morning after it was raised, 3,500 years ago. Some things are simply too large to erase. She knew it when she built them. She knew that the stone would outlast the person, that the monument would outlast the monument maker, that the name carved in granite would endure past the lifetimes of everyone who tried to remove it. She built for exactly this moment. For you. For a stranger in an unimaginable future. Hearing her name in the dark and understanding. Perhaps for the first time. Perhaps again after having forgotten that she was real, that she ruled, that she built, that she sent ships to the ends of the known world and brought back trees, that she refused to be erased. It is very late now, or very early. The line between the two is thin at this hour. The way the line between waking and sleeping is thin. The world outside wherever you are is quiet. The urgency of the day has faded to something softer. The things that seemed important in the morning feel, at this distance, slightly smaller and slightly more manageable. Let that smallness settle, because I want to bring you to the temple one last time. Not in the daylight, with the tour groups and the cameras and the explanatory signs in multiple languages. In the dark, in the middle of the night, when the valley is silent and the cliffs are pale under the stars and the entrance to Jezeru is a rectangle of deeper darkness in the darkness. Go into the temple in your imagination. Walk the ramp from the lower terrace to the middle terrace. Feel the stone underfoot, worn smooth by 3,000 years of feet. The priests, the worshippers, the tourists, and before them all, the builders, the workers who cut this stone and carried it and placed it with a precision that still impresses engineers who study it today. Walk the colonnade. The columns cast no shadows now. There is no light for shadows, but you know they are there. You can feel the regular spacing of them in the way the air moves differently as you pass between them. The painted walls are to your inner side. In daylight, you could see the divine birth sequence, the expedition to Punt, the gods carrying the infant Hatshepsut to be shaped on the divine potter's wheel. In the dark, you see nothing, but the walls are there, the images are there, beneath any damage, beneath any plaster, in the stone itself. Some of the paint is still there. 3,500 years old, still holding its color in the protected spaces that the sand filled and the archaeologists emptied. Red and blue and green and gold. Still saying, I was here, I built this, I existed. Reach out in your imagination and touch the wall. That is stone that a woman touched. That is stone that was placed under the direction of a specific human intelligence, with a specific vision of what this space should be, and what it should say about her and her God and her reign. She is very far away, and she is right there. I want to tell you about what has survived of Hatshepsut's reign. Not to inventory it, that would take longer than one night, but to give you a sense of its scale. Jezeru stands, damaged, restored in sections, studied and debated and admired. It stands. The obelisk at Karnak stands, and the fallen one lies nearby. In the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, there is a large gallery dedicated to Hatshepsut, one of the most important collections of objects from her reign anywhere in the world. It includes statue fragments, relief carvings, small objects. Some of these were among the thousands of fragments recovered from the pit at Deir el-Bahari, where her statues were buried. Pieced together by archaeologists with extraordinary patience, they give you in the round and in 3 dimensions, a sense of the original statues, and through the statues, a sense of the person who ordered them. She had a particular face, a serene face, with high cheekbones, and a slight, composed expression that some people read as serenity, and others read as determination. Probably it was both. The eyes are open and level. The chin is slightly lifted. She looks forward. Always forward. That seems right for a person who spent her life looking toward what she intended to make real, rather than backward toward what she had been told was possible. What else survives? The record of Punt, entire and detailed, on the walls of her temple. The records of her administrative decisions, preserved in scattered papyri and inscriptions across the landscape of ancient Egypt. The memory of her, preserved against all odds by the very strategies used to suppress it. Because when you bury something in a pit rather than destroying it, you preserve it. And the stories. The stories that people who love history have been telling and retelling since the scholars of the 19th century first began to reconstruct who she was. Stories told in books and documentaries and podcasts, and tonight, here, she survived in the telling. And you are part of that survival now. You have heard her name. You have heard her story. And the story does not stop when the telling stops. It settles into memory, into the part of the mind that keeps things without being asked, that files away the faces and the details and the moments that mattered. She will be there when you wake up. Come back now to the night, to the quiet of wherever you are, to your breath, which has slowed, and to the weight of your body, which has settled. We have traveled a long way tonight. We went to Thebes in the year 1507, before the Common Era, and watched a child be born who would change the world. We followed her through the palace, through the marriage, through the quiet years of watching and planning. We watched her take the throne, not in a moment of violence, but in a sustained, brilliant act of political architecture that has few parallels in history. We built temples with her, and sailed to Punt with her, and raised obelisks that blazed in the morning light. We watched her die. We watched her be erased, systematically, patiently, with the full resources of an empire. We watched her be buried under 3,000 years of silence, and then we watched her come back, from a tooth, from a box, from the patience of the stone that held her name beneath the plaster for 35 centuries. She came back. There is a word the Egyptians used for this hour. The hour of the rising of the sun's disk. The moment between night and day. The moment that was, in Egyptian cosmology, the most sacred of all. The moment when Ra, the sun god, emerged from the underworld and began his daily journey across the sky. The moment when, each morning, the world was created again. Hatshepsut lived in a world where that moment was sacred, where the boundary between night and day was the boundary between death and life, between the underworld and the living world, between what had been and what would be. She would have known this hour well. She would have stood in the temple in the dark and waited for the light. She would have heard the priests begin the morning chant and felt the stone floor grow warmer as the sun came up. She would have watched the obelisks catch the first light and blaze. In a few minutes, or a few hours, or whenever your body is ready, you will make your own crossing from night to day, from the world of this story back into your ordinary life, which is also an extraordinary life. Because all lives that are lived with attention and intention, and even a little courage, are extraordinary. Take her with you, not as a burden, as company. The memory of someone who looked at a world that told her who she was, and what she was allowed to be, and said, quietly and firmly and without drama, "No, this is what I am," and built accordingly. One last thing. The ancient Egyptians believed that the stars were the Ba, the souls of the dead pharaohs. When a pharaoh died, their soul rose from the mummified body and ascended to the northern sky, where the circumpolar stars move in their slow eternal circles, without ever setting, without ever dipping below the horizon. The pharaoh became a star, permanent, visible, part of the framework of the night. Is there a star that was Hatshepsut? In the logic of her world, yes. In the logic of her world, she is up there. She made the crossing she had prepared for all her life, through the 12 hours of the night in the duat, past the 42 judges, past the scales where her heart was weighed against the feather of truth. And she ascended. The feather of truth is Mart Pot, truth and cosmic order and right action. The heart that weighs less than that feather is the heart that lived rightly. The heart that weighs more is consumed by the monster who waits beside the scales. We do not know, and cannot know what Hatshepsut's heart weighed, but we know what she built. We know what she reached for. We know that she looked at a world that was not designed to include her at its highest level, and she built her way in, not through destruction but through creation, not through anger but through vision, not through the suppression of others but through the sheer overwhelming fact of what she made. If any heart in ancient Egypt was as light as a feather, you might reasonably make the argument that it was hers. Close your eyes now. Let the image settle. The valley, the cliffs, the stars, somewhere in the northern sky, moving in slow circles that have not changed since she was alive. A star that has watched everything. Every empire, every erasure, every rediscovery, watching still. Her name was Hatshepsut, Martkara, foremost of the noble ladies, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, daughter of Ra, the one who sent ships to Punt and raised obelisks of Electrum and built the holiest of holies at the base of the limestone cliffs, the one the stone would not let go. Sleep now. The night is long and the stars are bright, and the Nile is moving in the dark on the other side of the valley, carrying its silt to the sea, as it has for 10,000 years, as it will for 10,000 more, patient and enormous, and utterly indifferent to the ambitions of human beings, and somehow, because of that indifference, deeply comforting. The river does not stop. The stars do not stop. The stone does not forget, and neither now will you. Good night.